Welcome to all of you joining us tonight. Motzei Shabbos, Parshas Vayechi Chazak.
You started already.
Let's try the mute again. Yeah. So before going into Inyan of Halocha, I want to share with you perhaps more al derech hadrush, but something which came my way this past week, where we had in the daily Tehilim. So in this past week, we said chapter Lamed Zayin in Tehilim. Now, there are about 8 chapters in Tehilim which are presented al Seder ha'Aleph Beis. The more famous ones are Ashrei and Kuf Yud Tes and Chof Hei, which we say in Tachnun. Then we have Lamed Daled, which we say Shabbos morning. There are also the 2 small Halaluchos before Hallel. And then we have 2 more. And one is Perik Mizmer Ches. It also has got some kind of Aleph base, not so obvious. And then we have Capital Lamed Zayin. Now, 2 points. Number one, there's an excellent set of Sforim called Yashmiel Kol Tehilosai, written by Rabbi Shmuel Heber, and it's following the style of the Torah Tmimo on Chumash, and is tracing every Maimer Chazal on a posuk in Tehilim, also according to the Mesorah, is really an amazing piece of work. And in his introduction, he addresses the various Aleph bases in Tehilim. And just one more point before getting to the point, and that is that in the minor Loshen, we also say several chapters of Tehilim which have got the Aleph base, including Kuf Yud Tes. And one of them is indeed this Perik Lamed Zayin. So you'll be forgiven for never having noticed it before, because it's 40 psukim, and the Aleph base is kind of intermittent. So you can see here, Al Tischar, Betach, here's Nun, and Narayisi, Sur Meira, then we have Pei, Tzadik, etc. So the Aleph base is intermittent. But what is interesting is that the letter Ayin does not appear. It came to my attention this past week that someone suggests that the last posuk, Vayazreim, which the shorish of is Ezra, comes to repair the missing ayin. Now, why are we having this conversation? Well, we have the precedent in Gemara Brachas about what we call Ashrei, and Omer Yochanan that Ashrei is missing the letter Nun, and because Nun stands for Neifel. And then after Yochanan says this, so Omer Nachman Levi Yitzchok, Afilo hochi chazav David was somchon beruach hakodesh, soymech Hashem l'chol hanayflim. So the idea of having a letter missing in the sequence of Aleph base is addressed there, and its restoration by soymech Hashem l'chol hanayflim. Similarly, in the chapters Chof Hei and Lamed Daled, is missing the letter Vav. Chapter Chof Hei is not only missing the letter Vav, it's missing the letters Beis, Vav, and Kuf. And in the captions in our Tehilims, in the early Yosef Yitzchak Tehilim, addresses that. But the base of Chof Hei is kind of restored because you have a double Aleph. You have Elech Hashem Nafshi Eso, Elekai B'chavotachti. The missing Kuf is also kind of restored by the fact that you've got 2 reishes, Rei Onyi and Rei Oivai. But the missing Vov, well, how is that repaired? So the missing Vav is repaired by the last posuk of Chof Hei, which is Pedei Elikim es Yisrael Mikol Tzoreisov. And as you're familiar, a Vav interchanges with a Pei in the system of Atbas, the first and last letter of the Aleph base is Aleph and Tov interchange, and the base and Shin, and as in that sequence of Vav and Pei interchange. So the Pei, the Dayan Levi Yitzchok Raskin, repairs the missing Vav. Similarly, in Perik Lamed Dalet, the David B'Shanoisoi is missing a Vav, but then it finishes off with Poide Hashem Nefesh Avodav, so the Pei at the end makes up the missing Vav. Of course, you're going to ask, why is the Vav missing? So for this, I'll refer you to the Sefer Yashmiya Kol Tehilot, Sefer Rabbi Heber, which I mentioned. And meanwhile, I'm going to focus on on chapter, as I say, chapter Lamed Zayin of Tehilim. Why is there, as you can see, it goes here, Chazayin is, you got Nara, you see, Nun, and then Samech, and then it skips to the Tzaddik, it skips to the Pei, and misses out the letter Ayin. And then there's the Ayin there. Okay, so this is the mystery. Why is there missing the letter Ayin in Tehilim Lamed Zayin? So we have a well-known Gemara in Kiddushin Daf Lamed Omid Aleph, and that's on the bottom of your screen. Lefichach nikra'u rishonim soferim. Why are the earlier generations referred to as soferim? Now we translate sofer as a scribe, but the word sofer comes from the notion of counting. Shehoyu soferim kol oisius shebetayra, because they would count how many letters there are in the Torah, and they counted to that degree of accuracy. Shehoyu oimim vav de gochoin chetzon shel oisius shel sefer Torah. In Sefer Vayikra, there's a talking about the non-kosher species, and it talks about an animal which crawls on its belly. Then it says the Vav of Gochen is the middle letter of the letters in the Sefer Torah. The words Dorosh Dorash, Esir Achatos Dorash Dorash Moshe, so that's the middle of the words of the Torah. The Posuk V'his Galoch, Vesanesek Le'egalech, etc., in Parshas Tazriach, I guess, is the middle posuk. So far for the psukim in Torah. Then it goes on in Tehilim. In chapter Pei, we have a posuk. Yechar semeno yichazir meyoar. It will be cut short by the swine from the forest. In the word yoar, the ayin is suspended above the line. Ayin de yoar, that ayin is chetz shon shel Tehilim. That's the middle letter of the Tehilim. And it doesn't say which are the middle words of Tehilim. It says, V'hu rachum yechaper oven is chetzyoy de psukim, is the halfway line for the psukim. Before going further, these cheshbonis are apparently don't match the numbers as we know them today. If you make a count, you'll come to a different result. And in the recent journal Or Yisrael, there's a certain Rabbi Meisels from Montreal who writes a fascinating article explaining what these cheshbonis are. And last night I saw also in an earlier sefer also addressing the accuracy of these figures. But that's not relevant for our discussion. Meanwhile, it says that the letter ayin is the middle letter of the Sefer Tehilim. What is the significance of that? So you look in Marsho in Kiddush Lechem, and he tells you that the ayin stands for Esav. And Esav is the Chazir Miyar. Esav is the Chazer, the swine of the forest. And there is a well-known Yiddish expression, kosher chazafisl, which means when someone professes to be pious and puts on a show of piety, and inside he's corrupt. And so this is the chazer has got split hooves, but doesn't chew the cud. It doesn't chazer. It doesn't repeat. It doesn't regurgitate its food. That's why you say you're not kosher, because you don't chazer. But it sticks out its hoofs, and it says, look, I'm kosher. So this is, and inside it's corrupt. So it says that Esau he was uh, he was he was guilty of adultery, etc., in a very corrupt way. But then he said, I don't want to get married before 40, like my father got married at 40. So he was putting on a show of piety when inside he was corrupt. So the ayin stands for Esav, and the Tehilim is the antidote to Esav. That's how the Mashal explains. So that's why the ayin kind of is reduced, and it's the mission, so to speak, of Tehillim to reduce the influence of Esav. Okay, now that we know that the ayin in Tehillim has got can allude to Esav, that could explain why the ayin is missing in this particular chapter, Lamed Zayin. Now, I do not have the facilities to check whether Lamed Zayin is halfway between the beginning of the Sefer and this Chazak, which is in chapter Pei. I haven't managed to check that, but it is somewhere around there. But look at the tochen of chapter Lamed Zayin. Do not al tischar b'mreim. Do not be jealous of the wicked. Al tekane be'osei avlo. Don't be jealous of those who do evil or crookedness. So it's talking about a relationship with the wicked, not to be worried, etc. Whatever it may be, but it's certainly addressing the Rishoyim and the relationship towards the Rishoyim. Therefore, it makes perfect sense that there should be here a downplay on Esav, and that's why the letter Ayin is left out. But as in the other three instances where the omission is repaired in some form, so then the ayin comes at the end of the chapter and not at the ayin at the beginning of the pasuk. But vayazrem, that instead of Esav it becomes Ezer, of help and support to Eden. One final thought on this non-halacha discussion, and that is that we say the pasuk v'hurachum at the beginning of Maariv. It's got 13 words corresponding to Yugim B'Sarachamim. Some Meforshim say that because we do not have the Korban Tomid, as we do have at Shachris and Mincha, Maariv, there is no Korban to atone. That's why we invoke the V'hurachum. V'lo yashkes, there shouldn't be cause destruction. Now, it becomes now very, very interesting. If the Vayazreim at the end of Lamed Zayin is the antidote to the ayin of Esav, and instead of Esav, it should be Vayazreim to help Yefaltim to save from the Rishoyim, well, then it makes perfect sense why this posuk also is put in Maariv at the beginning of Maariv, following on from the posuk of V'hurachum Yechaper Ovim V'lo Yashchis, to then, before the three times Hashem Mashiach, to have this posuk of Vayazim Hashem Vayefaltem, Hashem will help and bring salvation. And just at this point, just the Eibusha shall help the hostages. They should have a Yeshua B'Korev Mamish. Okay, that's what I wanted to share with you at Divrei Agoda. I'm going to go now on to the next point. But before that, I saw that on the chat there was a few points. So, right. So, Aria Freeman is telling us that the middle letter, that's what actually this article writes, that when it says that Gochain, the Rov of Gochain is the middle letter, it refers to the middle letter of the enlarged letters in the Torah. You have a whole aleph base of large letters in Tanakh and a whole aleph base of small letters in Tanakh. And so the Rov of Gochain is the middle of the large letters in the Torah. That's one of the explanations given. By the way, if anyone wants to read the full list of the minor and larger letters in Tanakh, if you have the Rambam edition of Rambam Le'am, at the end of the volume of Sefer Ha'avo, he has the full list. Right. Mendel Safrin is saying that the posuk that begins with Samech has an ayin. So yes, let's go to that. So this it's got the ayin once, twice. Okay, okay, and v'lo yazov. Okay, fine. And then but then you have another ayin. All right, and you got another ayin. Okay, fine. So now let's go on to our questions. So on for this past Friday, because of the fast, so then there was a major international concern what to do about Kiddush, etc. So there's two concerns. One is that well, two different scenarios. You have that some Kehillas in New York and at Yisrael, by the time you finished Maariv, it's almost the 6th hour, the 7th hour. So then you have the dilemma. Do you daven Maariv early so that you could eat and make Kiddush before the 7th hour? Or do you daven Maariv on time and not wait and make Kiddush during the 7th hour? That was a dilemma which Rav Ashkenazi and Rabbi Broin, etc. It was I was I mixed out of that one because it wasn't relevant in this country. We finished Maariv about 5 o'clock, and so there's plenty of time to get home and make Kiddush long before the 7th hour started. But the other question, which I was asked by several shluchim, in some of the Bati Chabad, they have Maariv a whole winter the same time. We're not going to go into the practical reasons why, but it's 6 o'clock is Maariv, let's say, and then followed by a Seudas Shabbos, whatever it may be. So fine. So he says the fast finishes 5:15. I have Maariv in my shul at 6 o'clock. Do I have to? Should I daven Maariv on my own and make Kiddush, or should I? This was the discussion, and so on the spur of the moment, Etor said it's okay at the time of the end of the fast to make Kiddush, and that you'll daven Maariv later. And my backing to that was that I know that in Manchester, the late Rav Weiss, the Minchas Yitzchok, so he would join the minyan earlier on, because for those who are not familiar in other parts of the world, in Manchester, in the height of summer, there's to daven Maariv Bismana, you're talking about 11 p.m. And not really so comfortable after that to come home and start eating Seudas Shabbos. So he would have this minhag of, I'm sure he wasn't the only one, of joining the tzibur for Kabbalas Shabbos, let's say 7 o'clock or something, whatever Plaga Mincha was. And then he would, after Kabbalas Shabbos, he would go home and have his make Kiddush and have his Seudas Shabbos. And then 11 o'clock, possibly got a minyan together, they davened Maariv Bismana. So by me, it was a double poshut. It's not a problem to make Kiddush before Maariv if necessary. It's not a seder, but in an exceptional circumstance, it's okay. So just to reassure myself, I looked this up in the Piskei Teshuvos, and he writes the same thing. Be'ez HaTzorich, you can make Kiddush before Maariv. Now here he's talking about making Kabbalas Shabbos early, possibly because he's talking about to do Kabbalas Shabbos even before sunset, and then you'd make Kiddush. But in this case, I didn't see such a problem to make Kiddush before Kabbalas Shabbos. It's Shabbos in any case, yeah. And now just one point that bichlal to eat before Maariv once it comes the time of Maariv. So here you have in Shulchan Aruch, it says in Siman Reish Lamed Hey, Osur lahaschil le'echol. Not allowed to start eating a meal. This is Shabbos or weekday. Not allowed to start eating a meal half an hour before the time of Krishma Shel Arvis. In other words, time for Maariv. On that, the Mishnah Berurah, which you see also on the screen, he says that you shouldn't eat before Maariv, and that's because you might forget but he said, but he says, Te'ima be'alma. He says, Lechol kimo, to eat a little bit, a small meal, no. But Te'ima be'alma, just to taste, would be okay. And mine peiris, or even pas kabetza. So therefore, for those people who did want to make Kiddush before davening Maariv, it would mean Kiddush, a cup of coffee perhaps, to have a few biscuits, but not to have a generous amount of food, of mezainis, and of other foods you could have a more generous amount. That's as much as I wanted to address about this question. And now we're going to go on to, already Shluchim are concerned about Purim, and Purim this year is on a Friday. And so for this shliach, it's the first time he has such a kvias on his new, relatively new shliach. So how do you do it? So many shluchim are have done this in the past, that they make a marathon. You make a Megillah reading, and then where before or after Megillah, the men will put on tefillin, and you start the meal, and then the meal is Sudas Purim, and then it comes Lichtsinden, so the ladies bench licht, and then after Shkia, then you make Kiddush, Payos Mapa Makadosh, and then it goes on to into a Shabbos meal, and also, by the way, if you share enough l'chaim, so then you've also solved the problem of Yidden driving home, because they won't be in a position to drive home. Okay, so now. So here's the question about what's called Peiris Mapo Makadosh. What does this mean exactly? So just to go through this simply. So we have here from Shulchan Aruch Siman Reish Ayin Aleph that when now when it comes Motzei Shabbos, you're for your middle of Shalosh Seudos and it spills over, you're allowed to continue your meal. But if you started a meal on Friday and it goes into Shabbos, you're not allowed to continue your meal because of the Chiyuv Kiddush. So you have here, the Chacham forbade us to taste anything, even water, once the time of Kiddush has arrived. But you don't have to completely abort the meal. Instead, you can make Kiddush in middle of the meal, and then you continue with the meal. And in that way, it's Kiddush b'makom sud. So at a given point after sunset, you'll stop and make Kiddush. And in order to show that this is Lekavod Shabbos, so he says you spread a cloth on the shulchan, you cover the challah primarily, to show that the bread now is brought to Kavod Shabbos. Hence the expression Peiris Mapo Mekadosh. So you'll make Kiddush, you'll cover the challah and make Kiddush. Now, if you've had wine, that's Sifyud Aleph, if you've had wine earlier on in this Purim Suda, so then you don't make a Be'er Priagofen, because you still have an Be'er Priagofen, which is, so to speak, in operation. Then what about Hamoitzi? So there's two opinions. Should you say Hamoitzi because there was a moment where you weren't allowed to eat bread, that creates a hefsek? And there are those who say that you can't say, you don't say Hamoitzi because... So as a result, Sofik Brochas Lahakil. So it's going to be a very unusual thing. You're going to make Kiddush without Hagofen, and then you're going to take up two challahs. I've never seen this, yeah? There's a story with Beryl Alenik, Olav Shalom. He came into the Rebbe and said that his wife, after giving birth, she stood in the Cheder Sheni in 770, and she said Birchas HaGoimel. And the Rebbe in mirth said to him, did the Bochrim say Shechianu? So now, here, I've never seen this person mapper stuff, but to stand up there and to hold up two challahs, or to say, that's it, and not to say Hamoitzi, and so it looks a little bit, to me it looks a bit strange. At any rate, and then you also have a Baal Nefesh, who said that Baal Nefesh, his guidance is that he should avoid this scenario because of you getting into a suffix whether you should be making Hamoitzi or not. All right, having said all that, so there is the room for this Eitzah of Peiris Mapo Mekadosh, which would mean starting a meal on Friday and starting Yom Sudas Purim, and it goes into Shabbos, and at a given moment after Shkia, you make Kiddush and Lechem Mishne. What I did recommend to the Shliach is you could, if you personally eat your Sudas Purim at 11 o'clock in the morning, So you've been Yotze Sudas Purim. So then you could be comes the evening, before Shabbos. You've done your Megillah. You're done now, and you get all the men to sit down and the women to light the candle, etc. And then after Shkia, then you stand up and make Kiddush. Now you didn't have any wine and you didn't have any motzi before, so you could then stand up and make Kiddush in the normal way with Hagofen, with you know, and then I'll come to Hamotzi, so you'll go and wash and you'll make Hamotzi and it'll look perfectly normal. They will be in the middle of the meal. You'll be just now starting your meal, and that's perfectly okay. Um, Bichlal, is this a Lechatchila Bichlal? This is another question because it's not so straightforward to start a meal just before Shabbos. Yeah, it shouldn't be affecting the appetite for your Shabbos meal. So this is not, it's not a Lechatchila. We're talking about you engaging with Yidden who otherwise will have very little Purim experience, the mitzvahs of Purim. So for this, you're being makel in this, but it's not a Lechatchila. Right. When would you daven? So that's a good point, and that is that in this Panorama scenario, you don't have to stop to daven. You can continue your meal, and when you finish the meal, then you daven. But yeah, that probably in practically also, if you stop your meal to do Maariv, that's probably the end of your Suda. Um, Someone's asking, didn't the Rebbe himself do Paris Mappa? I don't know. I know that in the earlier years, it was done by the Rebbe's Farbrengens and also in earlier generations in Lubavitch. Although there was a reluctance, as far as I never heard that the Rebbe himself was Paris Mappa Makadesh, and later years it was phased out. Right. So we come on to the other question about how late in the day can you have Sudas Purim. So you have here on the screen, this is from the Sefer Nesivim B'Stei Shlichus Chelik Beis, where I had written that you could, it's you on Friday to have the Sudas Purim earlier in the day, and but you at least before Shor Asidis, before 3/4 of the day, before the last quarter of the day. Now in the Ramah, he writes that you should have the Suda in the morning. So where did I get this about Shor Asidis? Well, the Alter Rebbe in Simaresh Memtes talks about that the issur of eating a meal on a Friday really kicks in from the last quarter of the day. And that was the basis of this being made. So now, here on the screen you have from Reb Chaim Noah, he's talking about a bris meal, or etc., which is on a Friday, and he says about starting the meal before Shor Asidis. He quotes then the Mishnah Berurah, he says that you should have it in the morning before noon. And Mishnah Berurah is drawing from Hilchos Purim, that like there are more in Hilchos Purim says to have the meal before midday, so the same thing should be a bris milah, which is on a Friday. To which Reb Chaim Noah says, possibly Sudas Purim is more more reason to be machmir, because Sudas Purim involves shichrus, and people take and therefore there's more concern of it getting out of hand, and therefore the advice to have it in the first half of the day before noon. That doesn't necessarily apply for a Sudas Milah. But meanwhile, we do see that there are Rishonim. We have here the Ramah, who's saying, and this is based upon Minhagim from Isaac Tirnau, where he says that Suda on Purim, on Friday, should be B'Shachris. And Shachris means before midday. So you've got here Rabbi Isaac Tirnau, one of the prominent sources of Minig Ashkenaz, of Purim on Friday to have the meal before midday. But surprisingly, we have also no less a personality than the Maharil, who is one of the most prominent voices in Minig Ashkenaz, and he says Sudas Purim, you can start Somach Lemincha. And so he's saying, in other words, till the last quarter of the day, you're allowed to start the meal. So if someone wants to rely on the on the Maril. Yesh lo al mi lismech. Okay, let's move on to something totally unrelated, and that is, I know we've done this before, but it's come up. Someone sent me these photographs whether you're allowed to make um, whether you're allowed to make these into jewelry. So are they allowed to melt? Sorry, we're allowed to melt them down. So they're gold apparently. They're allowed to melt them down to use to recycle. Now, the one to the left has got an artist's impression of Moses and some kind of lettering there. I don't see a problem in melting that down. The middle one, the Aseret Hadibris, is not my concern, but the Shin Daled Yud at the top, that wouldn't be allowed to be melted down because it's Hashem's name, not allowed to disgrace Hashem's name. Now, the one to the right is, I think, meant to be Shin Daled Yud, and therefore, I'm not so sure. It looks like a Daled or a Vov, but if it's a Daled, then you wouldn't be allowed to melt it down. Okay, yes. Now, someone raised the question about Al Hanissim. So, if you don't make a break, in other words, if you do this Purim Suda, overflowing with Kiddush in the middle, going into Shabbos, and comes to benching, you'll say Al Hanissim and Ritzei, and that's okay. And if you want to look up in the Nesiv Mishneh Shlichus, that's been discussed over there, and also elsewhere about the Friday-night Maariv talking about similar situations where you got Yom Tov on a Friday going into Shabbos, and he says you should say Ya'aleh v'Yovoi and Ritzei, even though the the Ritzei for Friday night is said before the Ya'aleh v'Yovoi of Friday afternoon. And he still says you say the way it is in the Siddur. If you make the break, now once if you if you make a break and daven Maariv, that's what your question is. If you daven Maariv in the middle of the meal, then you shouldn't be saying Al Hanissim in benching, as far as I remember. Okay, so that's that. That's what we have here. Where does it say you're not allowed to erase Hashem's name? So here you have Simon Reish Ayin Vav. Also, it's forbidden to erase even a single letter from one of the 7 names which mustn't be erased, and also the letters which are suffixes. So the chof in elikecha, or the chof mem of elikechem, the suffixes. Whereas the prefix would be the Hedin would be more lenient, and he lists the 7 names, and one of them is Shin Daled Yud. Okay, I'm going to the next point is a very, very simple point, but if someone asked me the question, possibly other people also have made the same mistake. And this is actually somewhere in Eretz Yisrael, and it's a kind of river brook and he's toivelt kalim in this. So I asked him, does this water flow only when there's rain, or even when there's or the whole year round? So he says, no, it's only when there's rain. Well, if that's the case, I told him that Tevila is not a valid Tevila because rainwater is only kosher as a mikveh when it is standing, when it is what's called ashboiren. That word mikveh means an accumulation of water. If it were spring water, meimayon, then it's kosher bezoichalin, even if it's flowing. But if it's megashomim or float or melted snow, so then that kind of water is not kosher in the running state, only if it were static. So unless you made a diversion, made some kind of a pool, but as it's flowing down the downstream, this is not kosher as a mikveh. Right. Let's move on. So here's a question which came up we're learning Gemara Rosh Hashanah, and there's a sugya of Baal Ta'acher. Baal Ta'acher means that when you've made a vow, a pledge, the original thing is talking about a korban. You pledged a korban, and if you don't bring the korban in time and you delay it and particularly if you delay it 3 Yom Tovim, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, so then you're in a violation of Baal Lechatchila the Purim. The Torah says you should not delay. So now here comes the question with tzedakah. So the Gemara says tzedakah also, delaying of giving tzedakah is also included in Baal Ta'acher, in not delaying. So let's read how it's brought in Shulchan Aruch. So what was my question? Let's say someone has a close relative or something who is a tzedakah case, and they help them. And this young man or woman will, in the next few years, hopefully get married, find a shiur and get married. And I've been helping them the whole time from my resources. Can I hoard my Meiser money and put it aside? And when it comes the time, they say to make this chasana, which I'm going to use. So can I hoard my Meiser money for that occasion? That's really my question. I think it's a very practical question. Or are you not allowed to hoard Meiser money? That's really the question. So we have here in the Shulchan Aruch Simresh Tammuz Nun Zayin Tzedakah. Tzedakah is like any other neder, and if a person makes a pledge, so then he has to give it right away. If he doesn't give it right away, he's in violation of Baal Ta'acher, because the Baal Ta'acher by tzedakah is nothing to do with Yom Tovim, because it's nothing to do with the Mizbeach, with the Beis Hamikdash, and therefore, since there are poor people available, so to speak, so then if you made a pledge to give tzedakah and there's poor people, so then you mustn't delay it. If there's no poor people, then you put it aside. And then he says, now, and this the middle part is from the Ramo, and then we go to the third part from the Mechaber, from the Shulchan Aruch. If I put aside money for tzedakah, then if I don't give it immediately, so then there's a problem of Baal Ta'acher. Now, this is very, very relevant for all of us. Aval kol odom yochel lahafresh moyes litzdaka, sheyiyu munochim etzlo litno me'at al yad. It is permissible to put aside money for tzedakah for distribution, bit by bit. So again, when we said that if a person makes a pledge for tzedakah and he doesn't give it right away, it's over Baal Ta'acher, that's when he put it to stam. Put about some money for tzedakah stam. But if, which is many of us, will have an account or a purse where we put tzedakah money there, and then when people come, so you'll give them, you don't empty the purse, you give them how much you feel is appropriate, and then you'll get another gift. The next person you want to be able to distribute to other people also. So then that you're not in violation of Baal Ta'acher, because you're going to distribute it me'at al yad. If you then he has about, if you had in mind to give it to the Gaboid stocker and they're going to make it change it into larger currency, another story. Okay, but meanwhile we do have the heter to put aside money for tzedakah to give it bit by bit. But that does leave me with a question. What about hoarding? To put aside large amounts, and meanwhile there are other aniyim which are coming your way. So that seems to be a question. I'm speculating that if you would put it into a separate fund, which is clearly designated for the benefit of those needy who you have in mind, and it's put aside already, then that might be a way of solving that problem. So instead of leaving it in your regular account, and then why aren't you giving it to other aniyim who are coming to your door? If it's put into a dedicated fund for this particular beneficiary, then possibly in that way you've avoided the inyan of Baal Ta'acher. What I did see, I'll see in a moment, there's a sefer from Reb Chaim Kanievsky called Derech Emunah. Now what he's done, he's taken the Rambam Hilchus Sefer Zroim, and he's made it like a Mishnah Brura style. And so the top is the Lashon of the Rambam, and underneath are his practical notes. So he writes here advice that when a person starts in putting aside Meiser money, they should have in mind that the money which they put aside should not have the status of tzedakah until it's given to the oni handed over, because otherwise you have this problem. If you're going to have money put aside and you don't give it to aniyim, you are getting into worries of Baal Ta'acher. Okay, let's move on. So someone came my way and asked me what's the source of not going to the same cave or the same grave twice in the same day. So this we have here on the screen is from Savos Rabbi Yehuda Chosid. And Savos Rabbi Yehuda Chosid, this is the mocker. He doesn't have a mocker earlier. Not to go to the cave of the same person twice in a day. Rather, you should, whatever you need to say the first time, and if you want to come back, you come back tomorrow. Interesting. You sometimes wonder, you went to the oil, and and then you realize, oh, there was something I forgot to mention. And so you want to go back and say, Bashgocha Protis, it was that you didn't mention it, and okay, you can't come back next day, but not to come back right after, oh, I forgot something. If you forgot your umbrella, you are allowed to go pick it up. That's okay. But we're talking about going back for prayer. That's Malachim say this. Okay. Now, two last things. One is that last week we had about egg rolls and how the pastry of the egg rolls was made from flour and water and a bit of spices. And my impression was that those egg rolls are hamotzi, because the filling is not a sweet filling, it's a savory filling. So someone pointed out, so I got only the packet. They didn't send me the packet, I couldn't sample the stuff. That's the problem with getting questions over email, that you don't get the samples. So now, so someone in the United States said to me that actually, if you see the full packet, it says there's two options. You can bake those things, or you can deep fry them. And obviously, if you deep fry them, then the broch is mazonos, not hamotzi. Okay, so just to clarify the egg rolls, in case you were worried about that. And now we're going to finish off our last point for tonight, and that is about someone that contacted me on Friday or the Thursday about a Sefer Torah, which has, by Vayechi, it has a gap of a couple of letters. And so is that okay? Is it not okay? Now, we all know the Rashi at the beginning of Parshas Vayechi, Loma Parshas Stuma, and because once Yaakov passed away, then the Eden's eyes were blinded, so to speak, from the suffering. Okay, and there's various pirushim. In Torah Shlema brings 4 different reasons, Loma Parshas Stuma, but everyone uses this word Parshas Stuma, just to clarify that the Parshas Stuma, in the Sefer Torah, there are gaps. And when the gap is open till the end of the line, so then that gap is called a Parsha Pesucha. When the gap is in middle of the line, there's words at the beginning and words at the end, and there's a gap in the middle, that's a Parsha Stuma, which is it's a gap, but it's a gap which is enclosed. But here we're talking about a total no gap at all. So here you have, there's a tshuva of the Alter Rebbe. This is the first tshuva in the series of the Alter Rebbe's tshuvas, and is talking about the gaps in tefillin. I'm not going to go into the whole parasha. That wasn't a pun, but yeah. You have the little gaps at the end of Shema and the beginning of Hoyim Shemoya. How exactly to work this out, and the Alter Rebbe disagrees with the Taz. But meanwhile, in that conversation, Mashma lehedya dehaves stuma gemura kamei parshas Vayechi she'ein sham pesucha klal, which is saying that there's no gap at all. So not like a parshas stuma, which means there's a gap of a couple of 3 letters or something, at least in middle of the line, or 9 letters. A parsha in Vayechi, it's stuma gemura. That's the Alter Rebbe's Lush. Okay. So now here's the question: B'diavad, or is it even Lechatchila, etc. So Sefer had written a Sefer Torah, and he had made a gap uh, of a couple of letters by Vayechi. So at first, my knee-jerk reaction was that it was wrong, and because I know this lashon of it's stuma gemura, and I have to be moide misvade berabim that I wasn't totally right in that, as you'll see. So first of all, looking on the top of the screen is the tikkun which I have in my house, and I thought it's very good tikkun. He actually even advises the sofer how many letters there are in the line, and there's an average amount of letters, and then if this is more letters than usual, less letters than usual, and so here you can see there's no significant gap between Yirbu Ma'oid and Vayechi. So there's no gap more than any between anyway. So that was my impression that there's no gap. Now here, going further down to the left, also a contemporary tikkun, which I found on the Oitzer, but here you can see that they made a gap. Then you can see the same advice of making a gap. This is a Chumash printed in Vienna, where it says no gap, but space of one letter. And then I have a tikkun printed in Amsterdam, also about 150 years ago. And here you see that they've left a gap. And then we have this print of a Chumash printed in Varsha 120 years ago. Again, it has here, you can see the asterisk, it's a tikkun Chumash, and it has here a little, like a little circle, and that leads you to the comment over here. Parshas Vayechi, ein kan pisko klal, no gap at all, kiyim revach ois achas, but there is a space of one letter. So they are all advising. So contrary to that first tikkun, which has no gap at all, here you've seen several tikkunim. And so I asked Rabbi Tiefenbrunn, I heard from my father, Allah Shalom, that the tikkun, the Barditchev tikkun, was a particularly reliable tikkun, and Sofrim would really go for that. And so he sent me this photograph, also from the Barditchev tikkun, the very same words, Ein kan pisko klal, ki im revach ois achas. So what I'm seeing is there's certainly many tikkunim which have a mesorah that although it's a stuma gemura, and still it does have a space of one letter. Now, my experience as a Balkoire on Mondays and Thursdays, they were always struggling to find where Vayechi starts, and because I never noticed a gap. But therefore I was surprised. But there you see that there are those who say that that you do leave a gap of one letter, etc. And what we have on the screen, and this is from the Sefer Chaim Shoal from the Chido. So Israel said Shuvas, Simon, where is it? Simon Ayin Dalad, Simon Sifhei. So here was the following scenario. There's a Sefer Torah that the Parshas Vayigash finished near the end of the line. There was a couple of letters left, space. And then in the next line, they left two letters at the beginning of the line, and then they started Vayechi. So this is really getting to a bit more of a problem, that they've created so when there's meant to be a parsha, a gap in the Torah, and you don't put in a gap, then that could be making it possible. And here the other way around also, where there shouldn't be a gap, and you put in a gap, that could be making it possible. So then he writes the following: although that Harav Hasholem, I think it's Rav Moshe de Lonzano. Rav Moshe Lonzano is one of the masters. Like you got the Minchas Shai, was someone called Noretzi. So you got the Ramdi Lonzano in his Sefer Or Torah is like a code going through the whole Torah, how to spell each letter, each word, sorry. So although Maram di Lonzano says not to leave a hafsek at all, however, minhag hakol hasoifrim is to leave a letter, a gap of one letter. So this is very interesting. So now we're seeing two minhagim. The Maram di Lonzano, who lived about 400 years ago, so he's saying no gap at all. The Chido is testifying that the minhag hasofrim is to leave. So that's one letter. But now here's not just one letter. Here's like a little bit more than that. Here the Chidah comes up with a very, very interesting explanation. Wait a minute. When you say Loma Parsha Zoistumor, what's the question? Why? Who made the Sedras? The Sedras were made by Ezra. The Torah is written, by Moshe Rabbeinu. The Abishah tells him what to write. So there were no Sedras then. So what's this question? Loma Parsha Zoistumor. There was. Why should there be a stuma? Why should there be a gap there? There was no Sedras. Perhaps the Sedra starts whatever, earlier or later. So he says, no. Be'etzem, this should have been a parsha, because the fact that by Ezra they made that the new reading starts from this point is because logically it should have been a gap. And hence the question, Loma Parsha Zoistuma, it's a question why, when the Torah was given in Bichsav, why was there not given a gap here? And the answer is that there should have been a gap. But because of Nistat Me'eneim, because of Remozim, in other words, he's saying, logically, there should have been a gap. But because of Remozim, there shouldn't be, there's no gap. Now, let's say you have in Torah, let's say I'm just going an example, the word Vayishokehu, and it's got dots on the word Vayishokehu. What happens if you have a Sefer Torah without dots? Or you have Anistoris Lashem Elokeinu, Vaniglas Lonu Levanenu, and there's dots. What happens if you didn't put in the dots? Is a Sefer Torah proposal? So the rule is that when a Sefer Torah is written, the letters are spelled out correctly, but some of these Remozim stuff are left out, the Sefer Torah is still kosher. So it says the Chidah, B'etzem, it is a parsha. No, why is there no parsha? Because of an emes. Okay, so it's missing the emes. It is a parsha, but it's, yeah, it should have been a parsha. Why is it not there? Why is no parsha? Because of an emes. So it's not like a regular made a stuma stam in the middle of where there shouldn't have been a gap. There ought to have been a gap. It's only that because of the emes. That's his way of verentfering, of allowing that the Sefer Torah remains kosher. That, and then he quotes also from a Sefer Admas Kodesh that Ein Ze Ikuv, but then this Sefer Admas Kodesh says, just use it this Shabbos, but afterwards make sure to fix it. Then he says, I saw someone else who says it's possible. So just before leaving you with a wrong impression, the Chidah is talking about a much bigger gap than what we've seen here of Ois Achas. He's talking about a gap of 4 letters or more. So then there's a whole parsha. Again, I'm getting to the puns again. But this Masorah, if that's the Masorah, okay, and don't think one has to do anything about it. Whereas there, if it's a larger gap, then there's room to make sure to be metaken. I'm going to see here what Reb Arya is writing here. And he says in Machzevit 3, he mentions Vayechi as a stuma. Well, the Rambam doesn't, yeah. Sofrim normally leave 2 letters space. Well, that's a little bit different to what is written Ois Achas and these various things. Okay. 3 letters would be problematic indeed, because that would mean a mini stuma. Right. First comment, full stuma mentioned in Sefer again, Machzevit 3. Okay. That's too much code for me for one evening. I'm going to stop here. I wish you all a guten Motzei Shabbos, a gute Woche, and we should hear Simchas, Besuras Tevis, Yeshua's v'nechomis, Yohu Hagula soll Mavasa sein, in der Geula Shlema with dem Mashiach Tzidkeinu v'meheri Amen Amen.
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 Koyach, Bruder.
Shkoyach.